Hey guys, wanted to do a different kind of video today. Wanted to do sort of a chess strategy video, and an explanation of chess strategy. One particular aspect of chess strategy, specifically the pawn center and the importance of the expansion of the pawn center. And the reason I wanted to do this video is because when I was first learning chess strategy, I would read these books and it would say, hey, a pawn center is really great and it's really cool to when the pawn center expands. Here's a game where the pawn center expands, and isn't that really cool how this happened? And I would read the chapters and I would say, okay, I would say to myself, that's interesting, and I see how it worked in this particular game. But the books really didn't do a good job of sort of explaining the general principles in such a way that I could take that concept of the expansion of the pawn center and sort of take general ideas from it and sort of use them so that in my own games. Maybe I wasn't reading particularly good chess books, and maybe some of you know some better ones, and you could suggest some titles or something for people. But so I sort of had to come into those understandings on my own. And what I wanted to do was sort of make a video, sort of hoping that I can explain some of those general ideas via the use of this game that I played, and sort of help those of you who are learning chess strategy or who are beginners about the importance of this pawn center and the expansion of the pawn center. So, some of you who are more advanced, this video may not be particularly helpful. That's fine. This is really more of a basic strategic ideas video. So, what's the importance of the pawn center? Well, the first thing we see. I'm just going to put this position on the board here. So this is a position where white has the two pawns abreast in the center, d4, e4. What's important about this? Well, the first thing you'll read in chess books is white has more space. What does that mean? Well, he's got specifically these squares d3 and e3 that are behind these pawns on d4 and e4. And he can put pieces on them, bishops, queen, whatever. And from those squares on d3 and e3, the pawns on d4 and e4 sort of act like a shield, protecting them from frontal attacks, so long as the pawns are, of course, defended, maybe even attacks on the diagonal. I mean, in this position, this diagonal is not really open, but you see what I'm saying. So the pieces can sort of sit comfortably there behind the pawns and wait for later action. The other reason it gives white more space, in a sense, is that it takes space away from black. So black would love to get pieces on any of these squares, but he can't because they're covered by these pawns. So having pawns in the center like this both gives white space for his own pieces and takes away squares from the black pieces, so he has less room to maneuver. This is sort of the general idea of having more space. So you read about that. That's all pretty basic, easy to understand. And then you'll see, especially, I think it was maybe Nimzovich one of the first people who really talked about this. He described that the pawn centers have a, quote, lust to expand. What does that mean? It means that it tends to be good in your chess games if you can push that pawn center forward in a good situation. So one reason for that is that if you push the pawn center forward, you oftentimes are able to chase away key pieces from your opponent's position. So, for example, if black has a knight on f6, that knight is often a good defender of like the h7 square and the king side. So if you can push forward e5, you can oftentimes chase that knight away, maybe launch a king side attack. Or if you have the bishop queen battery, like the queen's on here and the bishop is on here somehow, you could attack the h7 square. So pushing the pawn center is often important because you can discoordinate or chase away some of your opponent's pieces from where he might want them to be. But also, one of the things that the pushing the pawn center does, and this is the part that's a little bit less clear when people talk about what's important about pushing the pawn center forward, is that When you push the pawn center forward, oftentimes what you get is a situation where the squares that the pawns leave as they move forward are often cleared for your pieces to come in. And in some situations, whole areas of the board can just be cleared off by these pawn centers. And what you can do is use those squares, those files, those diagonals that are cleared by pushing this pawn center forward as highways into your opponent's position. And that's really the key idea that we're going to be looking at here today. So, hang on, let me just make sure I have this game here. Yeah, okay. So this was a game I played. The game is not of particularly high quality by black. Really, I was white and it wasn't super high quality by me, but at the right moment I found the right idea. So let's just go through this a little bit. Queen's Gambit declined. I played Knight C3. I'm not going to go into the opening too much or any of the details of this game because we're gonna try to get quickly to the key moment and the center. So E6. This is a semi-Slav triangle system sort of thing from black. I played it like trying to transpose into a regular Slav with E3. Okay, Knight F6. So we have a standard sort of Slav position. I played B3. This is I like the system against the Slav because the idea is oftentimes black wants to take this pawn and play B5, and the bishop will lose a tempo, recapturing. So black wants to take this pawn and then engineer one of these breaks. And with B3, white has the option of retaking with the pawn, keeping a pawn towards the center, controlling some squares. It does weaken some, potentially some, oops, oh, sorry about that. It does potentially weaken some dark squares, and it is a pawn move in the opening, as opposed to a development move. So there are some downsides to it, but I like the system. Knight BD7, Knight F3, Bishop B4. This is a pretty standard place to develop. You could also go to B6. The idea here is that black wants to pin the knight and control E4, so that it's harder for white to get in E4, because the knight's either pinned and then this knight can just take, or in the event of E4, you can even trade the bishop and then the pawn will be hanging. Trade the bishop for the knight and the pawn will be hanging. So trying to control E4 here. Bishop D2, unpinning. Standard castles. Bishop E2. These are all just development moves. Castles. B6, standard. Wants to put the bishop on B7 and hopes that that someday the center pawns will disappear and the bishop will be open on this long diagonal. Queen C2, standard. G6. Not going to say much about this move, but I think it's just sort of a nonsense, really. I don't know what the point of this move was. It weakens dark squares around the king, and this bishop's a little far away from that. That's not really going to be important right now. Rook D1. This is a standard idea in the Slav positions. Black wants to play D takes C at some point and play for E5. The idea of this rook move is just sort of put pressure on the D5 square and try to make it difficult for black to get into one of those breaks. A5, and now I played bishop to E1. This isn't the idea. I had here was just to keep the rook open on this file, put more pressure on D5, so it makes it a little harder for white to play E5. This wasn't the best idea. I definitely should not have played. I should have played bishop to C1, rerouting the bishop quickly to the long diagonal, because the knight's no longer pinned, because the king's castled. So that would have been a better plan. Not a terrible move, not a losing move or anything, but okay. So black exchanged, and now we've got the pawn center and also open B file, stuff like that. So we'll just move along here. That was not what was played. Bishop D6. The bishop's not really doing anything on this diagonal anymore, so he just wanted to put it on a square where it might better prepare E5. H3, just making some space. Okay, some moves here that aren't particularly important. A4, just to sort of put extra pressure on this weakness. Okay, defending the weakness, and I moved the king out of the way because I wasn't really sure what to do in this position. h5, and these moves aren't particularly important. They're just a little bit. Okay, here we go. Now in this position, black needs to do. If black is going to do something, he needs to do something in the center. He needs to play either for e5 or c5. In this case, my opponent chose to play c5, which looks logical because it opens up this bishop, which is really doing nothing in this position except staring at this pawn. But this is actually a strategic mistake, and I'll explain why. First, because it gives up this b5 square. This is now a permanent weakness. And the knight could very nicely come in here into b5, attacking some of these light squares. But more importantly, because it gives me a chance to play d5. And after some exchanges, we see that now white has these two pawns in the center, and these pawns very quickly may have the opportunity to expand. So rook e8, putting pressure on the e pawn. Fairly logical. I just wanted to defend it, overprotecting this pawn because I would like to get this knight into b5, but at the moment there's too much pressure. Before I put the bishop there was too much pressure on this pawn to do that. So trying to exchange bishops, but now I can put this knight on b5, and I have enough stuff to cover here. Now he plays bishop to f4, and I wanted to put this bishop on the long diagonal, obviously, because there's a lot of pieces on that diagonal, and this position is already very bad, in fact strategically lost. But let's get to the moment where it becomes important to see the illustration of the pawn center moving forward. This move, rook c8, is logical. He wants to play c4 and maybe get the c5 square for his knight. I didn't want to deal with any of that, so I played deep blue style bishop c4, just preventing this pawn, and also potentially opening the bishop on this diagonal. Oops, the first one, which we'll see is important in a moment. So black has got a lot of problems here on the long diagonal, a lot of pieces on that diagonal, and the bishop is very powerful there. So he makes a move, king g8, to try to start getting pieces off of that diagonal. It seems logical, but it allows me to play a rook to e1. And now I have enough pieces covering the e5 square to start pushing. So this is trouble for black. So let's see what happens. Queen gets out of the diagonal. Now e5. So we see the two pawns in the center are starting to move forward, and we see that the first thing that I was talking about earlier, it chases some pieces away. The knight on f6 is probably a decently defensively placed there, and f6 would probably like to stay there if possible. Now it can't. At least for a little while it has to move away. And it has no other square to go to except for this h7 square, which is a very poor placement for this square. So what next? Keep moving it forward. Now this knight is being attacked. Pawn takes, pawn takes. Now this knight comes into f6, and now we see, of course, again the power of the bishop on this diagonal. Okay. e7 check. King has to go back into this pin on this poor diagonal. And now let's take a look at this position. First thing is that we see that the pawn center has moved forward, and obviously I have a very strong pass pawn here on e7, which is important, but also I wanted to point out some other strategic sort of features of the position. The pawn center, if you remember, was on here and here, just not too many moves ago. But now that it's moved forward, it's cleared a whole lot of diagonals, files, and squares for my queens and my other pieces to come in through, especially the bishops. Now that the pawn center has moved forward, look at how open these diagonals are. Those diagonals are very powerful in this position where the bishops are. At some point I can move a bishop back here. Look at how open the files are. D file. And in a move or two, and now because of this pin, right, because the knight's absolutely pinned, some of these light squares are very, very open. So the idea when you push the pawn center forward is that it leaves behind open lines and open files for your pieces, and you can use them as a highway into your opponent's position. That's the key strategic idea when you talk about moving the pawn center forward. So what happened in this game? Queen e4, taking advantage of the pin. And black played g5. There's not much to do here. And now queen e6. I've got the control of this diagonal. The queen is threatening to come in maybe to here, come around here, put pressure on this pawn. The key idea in chess, of course, is to try to get your pieces into your opponent's position. And when your pieces are there in your opponent's position, you cause all kinds of problems for them. That's sort of the general idea, is when you win the strategic battle of a chess game, it means that sort of your pieces are sort of coming into your opponent's position in one way or another, either by checkmate or attacking weaknesses. That's what you're ultimately aiming for, is to invade your opponent's position somehow. So when you push these pawns forward in the center, it gives you lots of open lines to play with. So now what happened in this game? What did happen in this game? Yeah, black is really stretched for moves here. The king can never get off of this pin, and so I played here bishop to d3. My idea is this knight is pinned and attacked twice. It's defended twice. So, but I thought I could maybe remove a defender, just take that knight, and then take the pawn. I would just be up a piece. So that's one idea that I had there. Black tried bishop takes b5. I just took with the rook. And he played g4. Interesting move. Maybe a decent practical chance. Just attacking the knight and hoping maybe if I exchange here and he exchanges here, he can get some counterplay with the queen and the bishop here on this h2 square. But in this position, I wasn't particularly interested in I didn't think he had enough time for this. I didn't want to give him this opportunity, so I just played rook takes b6. And the idea is that after he takes the knight, which he did, I have a nice combination, which I played. And there are literally, I mean, if you give this position to an engine, there are tons of wins. But the one, or actually, if you give this position to an engine, there are tons of wins. But in this position, the one I chose was, I thought, a nice finish. Queen takes, queen sack, so that I could promote this pawn. And remember, the knight is pinned to the king. So that's check. My opponent tried knight to f8. Just trying to hang on. But after rook takes f6, there's literally nowhere for the queen to go. The only chance is really to take the queen and just play the position down a rook, and soon to be down more material. But queen to this doesn't help at all, because the rook takes the pawn is checkmate. Queen is pinned. Can't take the rook. King has nowhere to go because of the bishops. So this is how the game ended. So that's just sort of an example of how quickly a thing can go badly for your opponent. So let's get to the key position here. So when we get this position where white has two pawns in the center. So remember, I'm trying to explain this in general terms, using this as an example. Not all positions are going to turn out so nicely like this in your games. So let's just move on here. Okay. So here it's already starting to look nice. You can see that by moving the pawn. We can see that by moving the pawn center forward, this bishop becomes super powerful. It looks stupid right now because it's staring at this pawn, but once they started moving forward, these lines all start becoming open. So the pawns start moving, chasing pieces out of the way as they go. And now this is the position that we sort of looked at and said, this is why expansion of the pawn center is so important. All these open files all these open diagonals, I mean, these open files, right? Very, very weak. And due to the pin, all of these light squares are very, very weak. So it leaves weaknesses. It leaves squares. It leaves files. It leaves diagonals for you to coordinate your pieces on and invade the position. So queen e4, and this is all, you know, I mean, from here you just you're spoiled for choice as white here, especially because of these powerful bishops. You can sort of do whatever you want really in this position, and this is the way I chose to win. But you could sort of, you know, you could really do whatever you want here. There was even a variation in this position if black tries to sack the queen. Like this. I can even play this like this, and threatening a discovered check and attacking two pieces. And there's no way, I mean, black's just going to be a rook and a piece down in that position and is resignable. So hopefully this sort of gives you maybe a little bit more of a crystallizing general concept of what the importance of the expanding of the center is. You know, I encourage those of you who are looking for more examples of this to look online and find games where you see pawn centers, pawns in the center. You can't really say, I can't really say this is going to happen every time you expand the center, because the features of the position are always different. But I think it's helpful to understand strategically and generally that when you are pushing the pawn center forward, the idea is you want to do it at a time where you can leave squares and weaknesses behind and open up lines and files for all of your pieces to invade your opponent's position. That's really the key point I wanted to hammer home, which is what happened in this game. So hopefully that was sort of helpful for you guys who might be sort of struggling or learning chess strategy. And yeah, if you guys like this, I might in the future, if I play a game or see a game where I said that's a really cool example of this particular aspect of strategy that helps crystallize things in a general concept, I might do a video on that too if you guys seem to enjoy it. So yeah, let me know what you think. Hopefully this was helpful for some of you, and I will see you next time. Bye.